Thank you everyone for joining me this morning. My name is Dr. Cayen Layton. I'm a researcher and a lecturer at the University of Tasmania based in Hobart. Alright, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing in southeast Tasmania specifically, restoring our Tasmanian giant kelp forests, so a little bit of the wetter types of forests and other stuff you might be about today. So it's certainly not just me as well. There's a relatively large team at the University of Tasmania working on this. So it's certainly, a real team effort, and this is just a real kind of case test about some of the big results and the work we're doing specifically at Great Southern. So I just want to start off by firstly acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands and the waters on which this work was conducted, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I think that's a really important consideration, but also one of our restoration sites, which I'll talk about later, are actually restoring in collaboration with an Indigenous community on Bruny Island and helping them restore their sea country. There really is a lot of attention on this work at the moment, and as I talk more about it, we'll talk about some of those novel aspects, but Tasmania is a global, Tasmania's oceans are a global ocean warming hotspot, so there's a lot of attention on Tassie for how we respond to the grand challenge of climate change. And so a side effect of that is we've got a lot of collaborators domestically, but also internationally, learning from our successes and also our failures. So I just want to take a little bit of a bigger picture look first and tell you about the Great Southern Reef. So a lot of people in Australia, I'm sure, have heard of the Great Barrier Reef, this amazing tropical reef system dominated by corals. Well, we've got this amazing temperate or cold water reef system dominated by kelp. Other seaweeds. Just like the Great Barrier Reef, it's formed from thousands of separate interconnected reefs that create this one continuous system, and it's over 8,000 kilometres long, so about 4 times the length of the Great Barrier Reef. And it stretches from the Queensland-New South Wales border all the way along our southern coastline, up to a similar latitude in Western Australia, and of course all around Tassie. And it's a global biodiversity and endemism hotspot, and by endemism I mean uniqueness, in that depending on the group of organisms you look at, that might be red seaweed or shrimp or fishes, 30 to 80% of those species occur nowhere else in the world. They are unique to southern Australia. So that makes the Great Southern Reef really locally important and regionally important, but also globally, because what occurs here doesn't occur anywhere else. But it's not only economically, it's not only environmentally important, it's also very economically important. And it directly contributes over $10 billion dollars to the Australian economy per year. And I emphasise directly there because that's what we know basically. So that's stuff like fisheries, some of the wreck fishing contributions in our coastal communities. But we really don't know those indirect benefits in terms of support of coastal food webs, other ecosystem services such as coastal protection and how that minimises erosion potentially. And that's really a key theme for the Great Southern Reef is how understudied it is. And really how underappreciated and undervalued in general. Incredibly photogenic, colourful, incredible environments. Again, Great Barrier Reef gets a lot of press, but I really think the Great Southern Reef is equally photogenic and equally colourful and magical. All these creatures you can see here occur nowhere else in the world, and they're not particularly rare creatures. These aren't taken at the best and only dive spots on the Great Southern Reef where you see these. You see these types of organisms and types of environments pretty much any dive you'll go on the Great Southern Reef, or a snorkel, or even rock pool, or along the beach. And I might be a little bit biased, but seaweed's kind of the star of the show, and especially kelp. So kelp are just large, brown, habitat-forming seaweed. We don't have that much of a diversity of kelp specifically on the Great Southern Reef. It's dominated by only about 3 or 4 species, which is quite unusual. But overall, the Great Southern Reef is this hyper-biodiverse hotspot, and for seaweeds especially, it's basically the richest environment in the world. It's the Amazon for seaweeds, and that's both in terms of the species richness and the diversity, but again, that kind of unknownness that we really don't know what's out there, and we really don't know what, it's just massively understudied, massively under-researched. Here in Tassie, we've got some of the most spectacular kelp forests of the Great Southern Reef, and we especially have great giant kelp forests. Now, giant kelp occurs to a lesser extent on the mainland, but Tassie, and especially eastern Tassie, is the real historical heartland for the species in Australia. Unfortunately, over the past several decades, we've seen about 95% reductions in giant kelp canopy cover. And I stress canopy cover there because all of these assessments are from, initially in the early days they were done by aerial surveys, some poor sod hanging out of the plane, taking photos. These days it's done with satellites and some more high-tech stuff. So we're really only looking at those floating canopies on the surface of the water. Again, once you get beneath the waves, a lot of that knowledge is far less known, and these habitats are far less surveyed. Those really significant declines are driven by changing oceanography in our region, especially increased temperature and decreased coastal nutrients due to the East Australian current. So the EAC, which you might be familiar with from Finding Nemo, the current that the turtles surf on, it's a warm, nutrient-poor current, and it's getting stronger with climate change, moving further south and bringing its warm, nutrient-poor water into eastern Tasmania. And unfortunately, giant kelp loves the water that's more cooler and nutrient-rich and is kind of more historically representative of Southern Ocean water and what historically would have been in eastern Tasmania. And again, like I mentioned earlier, that extension of the East Australian current is leading to eastern Tasmania being the global ocean warming hotspot. We're warming about 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. So in many ways, we are really a window into the future, right? And the changes that are happening here right now are going to happen elsewhere in the world over the coming decades. And those really significant declines led to giant kelp forests being listed, nationally listed as an endangered or threatened ecological community. And that was actually the first marine community to be listed as such. So these losses are really recognised domestically as being very, very significant. So is there help for our kelp? Can habitat restoration help slow down some of these declines and maybe even get some of those giant kelp forests back in our water? Well, a really core tenet for any restoration on land or in the ocean is, can you overcome or address that initial driver of decline? Clearly there's no point spending resources on restoration if the cause of the habitat loss is still there. So in this instance, it's climate change, it's ocean warming. Unfortunately, they're not things we can fix in the short to medium term. So we're taking a little bit of a reverse approach to it. We're seeing if we can help restore populations of giant kelp that are slightly more adapted to our modern environment, the conditions that we've created, frankly. So how we're doing that is we're looking at that remnant 5%. Giant kelp still occurs scattered up and down the east coast of Tassie, all the way, and along our northern coastline as well, all the way from Eastern Point down to the very southern, Cockle Creek. Especially in the north, though, there's no more forests. They're often just scattered individuals, maybe only 1 or 2 throughout an entire bay. But those individuals still grow quite tall, they're still reproductive, they still produce babies, little baby kelp. They just don't form those forests that they used to. So we went out and harvested spores, just taking leaf clippings. Some of you might be familiar with ferns. If you flip them over, they've got the dots or the spores underneath. Kelp actually have a very similar life cycle. So we took some leaf clippings, which is that top right photo there is what the specialised spore-bearing leaf from the giant kelp at the base. Took some leaf clippings, took them back to the lab and released those spores. We did that for 8 individuals across 6 populations, so we've got about 50 individual genotypes or strains, so those spores from specific individual kelp. And we keep them under red light, and that's actually a little trick where we can exploit a quirk of their biology. We can basically put them in suspended animation. So they don't, they still survive and thrive and they kind of persist, but they don't grow or mature to the next life stage. So it means we've got this replenishing kind of culture that we can sample from without having to go out to the field and collect them. And then for our breeding efforts especially, it means that once we've tested an individual, we can go back to that flask and say, okay, that's the one we want to cultivate more of because it's more warm water tolerant perhaps. And that's really what we're looking for, that warm tolerance. Are there individuals within the remaining population that are just naturally more tolerant to warm water? The same way some humans are naturally taller than others, our hypothesis was that some giant kelp may be more tolerant to warm water, just naturally just random genetic variation. And then part of that culture collection, we've also set up a seed bank, which is in a secondary location, and we've actually just moved it to another location as well, so we've now got kind of 3 versions of this, and it provides both a form of backup for us in case something catastrophic was to go wrong with one of our culture rooms, power loss, whatever, but also a form of genetic conservation. Obviously these losses have been so severe, it can be very important into the future to preserve that genetic makeup. So using all those cultures, we ran what's called a common garden experiment, which is basically you just grow them in a range of conditions with only one factor modified. In this instance, we modified temperature. So we grew them from 12, 16, 20, and 24 degrees with the idea that those individuals that survived in those warmer temperatures are going to be those individuals that might be able to help our restoration efforts. The 24 degree was really kind of meant to kill them all. You know, it's basically the published thermal maxima, the maximum temperature the species survives at anywhere globally. We don't get those conditions anywhere in Tassie, so we were expecting that temperature to kill them all. And then 20 would kind of be our, that temperature bracket we were looking at where those super kelp, those warm tolerant individuals might persist. So of those 50 strains that we tested, we found about 15% of them did exhibit increased tolerance to warm conditions, and not just a degree or two, actually 3, 4, 5 degrees warmer than kind of the population average. And amazingly, we even found survivors at that 24 degree treatment. So that was really incredible. These are temperatures well beyond what these individual kelp experience in the field, but it just goes to show what, I guess, genetic potential there is out there in these remnant forests. Interestingly though, the site or the region that we collected them from wasn't related to their thermal tolerance. So those individual kelp growing in Eastern Point, where it gets far warmer than Copper Creek, for example, were on average no more tolerant than individuals from the south. So we went back to those cultures in the red light, and we selected those individuals that we knew displayed the above average warm water tolerance, and we cultivated them up in really large quantities. It's a little bit hard to see here, but this is a small plastic plate that we drilling using an underwater cordless drill, a very kind of cool piece of kit. And we planted these in 3 separate restoration trial patches, 100 square metre patches throughout the southeast of Tasmania. And the aim was to create these self-supporting, hopefully, but also self-expanding restoration kind of seed patches, with the idea that restoration is never going to work, especially in the marine environment where it's pretty tricky to access, pretty expensive to access. With me and my colleague going out planting small plastic discs, we really need to kickstart the natural cycle and get these seed patches repopulating broader areas and expanding on their own accord. So that happened 12 months ago. We were delayed with COVID like everyone else around the world. And that meant we weren't able to plant them last autumn, which is kind of the ideal time to plant giant kelp because that syncs up with their natural reproductive cycle. We ended up planting them in spring, pretty much a year ago right now. And we were quite, I guess, pessimistic about how they would survive because obviously with warm waters being their main threat, summer's the worst time for them and you're planting these juvenile kelp that are only a millimetre or 2. Again, on this plate there's thousands of little baby kelp. They're so small you can't even make out the individuals. But we planted them at this very delicate, sensitive life stage. And then so we weren't sure how they persist through summer, especially we were forecast to have a La Nina summer, which is a slightly warmer than average summer for us. So it was really going to be a baptism of fire for them. After summer, we went back, late summer, and amazingly, at 2 of the 3 sites, we had survivors. And those individuals, they looked really well pigmented. They had very limited necrosis or dead or dying tissue. So that was a really nice early indicator that that thermal tolerance we detected in the lab was actually being transferred to the field. And relative to some of the natural giant kelp around that region, they looked in really, really good nick. And actually the most recent surveys, one of which was just yesterday I was in the field, and then a week ago at Fortescue Bay, we've now got 40 to 45 kind of middle-aged giant kelp at these patches, in these 100 metre square patches. Average size around 2 metres in both of these patches. But some of the individuals at Fortescue Bay larger than 5 metres, and some of the individuals we measured yesterday are almost at the surface, larger than 11 metres. So pretty incredible to see that type of growth over only 1 year. And I guess some of the people that work in terrestrial forests might be a little bit jealous of our growth rates. 11 metres, and I was thinking of the talk before me, this 3-year cycle of monitoring, well, we've got 11 metres in a year. So really incredible environment. And these little patches are really starting to look like little areas of giant kelp. These are some photos I took just yesterday, just slid in last night. But really, really exciting for us is that the giant kelp that we planted, those lab cultivated super kelp, are now reproductive. They've got that spore-bearing blade, and so that's really exciting for us because that's transitioning to the next stage of the project where we start to assess whether or not these patches are self-expanding and also self-supporting. So I'm just going to finish on this slide. A little bit just about the kind of the ethics and the background decision making. Obviously these are pretty intensive kind of interventions in our environment, going out, selecting, potentially moving genotypes from one place to another. But we had a little bit of foundational knowledge that giant kelp forests in Tasmania are genetically very connected, and there's really little difference between individuals at population level from the north to the south. So that gave us and the regulators, because we had to get permits to do this obviously, that gave us and the regulators kind of confidence that we weren't, necessarily, our plantings wouldn't be at the detriment of the natural genetics, because we weren't potentially moving individuals from the north genetically different to the south. There was also none or very little giant kelp left at the sites that we chose to restore the kelp. That was one of our criteria for our restoration sites, and that meant that we weren't, again, going to be interfering with that local genetic and potentially causing genetic pollution. And I put two little asterisks there because of one of those sites, literally the week we were out planting, the first little patch of giant kelp popped up, a natural little patch of giant kelp, the first giant kelp I've seen at Fortescue Bay for 4 years. We don't know where it came from. Again, that's part of that magic and that unknownness of the Great Southern Reef, where you can just get a patch of 4 metre tall giant kelp pop up out of nowhere. But so there is natural giant kelp also at Fortescue Bay at the moment, just a small patch. These are really only currently very small trials. We're not even walking before we're running, we're at the stage where we're crawling before we're walking. So we're taking this very slowly, we're making sure what we're doing is not going to impact our existing kelp forest and our existing giant kelp. And we'll need to get new permits and have all these discussions again when we expand, if and when we expand. And really the next stage of the project, like I said, is monitoring these patches, going back to them seasonally, assessing, hopefully, fingers crossed, touch wood, the first kind of generation of wild super kelp that have recruited and generated from our little seed patches. And also improving our planting methods. There's a whole bunch to do here on that space. So again, I'll just leave you the acknowledgement of there's like a big team here. We share knowledge all across the world. There's a lot of eyes on this project, and we're really learning from other people's failures and other people's successes and sharing our own failures so that others can learn from them. All right, thank you very much.